as the United States continues its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, as the United States continues to provoke and expand conflict in the Middle East, the US is continuing its process of reshaping its military forces for an eventual war with China in Asia Pacific. I wrote an article for Global Times. It is right here. It is titled US Air Force's Plans to Reorganize in Preparation for War with China Won't Work. This was published February 5th, 2024. The article will be in the video description below, a link to it. However, when you write articles like this, you have a limited amount of space, and then occasionally editors will chop it up even more. So what I want to do is, in addition to providing you the link, I will read it in full as I intended. I will also add additional information and context as I go through it. So the article begins, the US Air Force is preparing plans to restructure itself on a scale unseen in decades, all as part of Washington's wider efforts to confront and contain the rise of China. Politico, in an article titled Air Force Preps for Mega Overhaul with an Eye Toward China. It's this article right here. The link to this will also be in the video description below, along with all other websites that I reference. This article would explain plans to streamline US Air Force bureaucracy, accelerate new uncrewed aircraft and fighter plane projects, and reorganize US Air Force units, all as part of developing capabilities to outmatch China. This process of reorganizing ahead of a conflict with China is already underway elsewhere in the US military. In 2020, the US Marine Corps began eliminating tank and towed artillery units and replacing them with mobile rocket and missile forces meant solely to fight China across the Indo-Pacific. So the US Marine Corps no longer has main battle tanks. They've completely reconfigured their force solely to fight China in the Pacific and nowhere else. Politico does not articulate the threat the US believes China poses, motivating Washington to undertake such radical changes. Across US foreign policy circles, the threat China allegedly poses to the US is often taken for granted, referred simply to as the pacing threat. During a January 2024 CSIS event titled Air Force Priorities in an Era of Strategic Competition, I will include the link to this video as well, U.S. Air Force General Richard Moore would even say,
talk all about what a war with China would look like and what we would need to prosecute a war with China. We do not want that war. We do not want war with China, and war with China is not inevitable. But if provoked and drawn into that war, we intend to win, and that's what this is all about. But there's nothing inevitable about this conflict. It does not have to occur, and it will not occur by our choice.
That's very interesting. Let me explain what he almost certainly meant. Yet throughout the same event, participants noted the U.S. Air Force's challenge of moving massive amounts of American military power into the Indo-Pacific, thousands of miles from America's own shores, along and even within Chinese borders, to prepare for and win a war against China. Now, they're talking about sustaining a large-scale conflict at the end of a supply chain thousands of miles long, stretching across the entire Pacific Ocean. And they refer to this as the tyranny of distance. And they talk about how difficult it is to move so much military force over to China to fight this potential conflict. And it never enters into their mind the fact that it's the United States crossing an entire ocean, facing this logistical problem to go and fight China because China refuses to cross the Pacific Ocean and menace the United States, where it is located, actually located on a map. The article continues. It says, the U.S. has a massive military presence across Asia with tens of thousands of troops stationed in South Korea and Japan. There's also a growing military presence in the Philippines. The US is militarizing these nations and has made it clear that they will be recruited into a US-led coalition should war break out between China and the US itself. Despite the US officially recognizing Taiwan as part of China under its One China policy, the US has armed the administration there and has even placed US troops on the island itself, an indisputable act of war. Now, I want to explain in greater detail this paragraph that I just read about Taiwan, because again, the Western media very deliberately misinforms Western audiences about the actual status of Taiwan. To clear it up without doubt, we can just go to the US State Department's official website, their webpage titled US Relations with Taiwan, and you can read all about it. You can read about the American Institute in Taiwan and how this is the organization the US uses to carry out the United States' unofficial relations with Taiwan. Because Taiwan is not a country, there are no official relations with Taiwan. There is no embassy, US embassy on Taiwan. It does not exist because it's not a country. You don't build embassies in places that are not countries. It also says here, the United States has a long-standing One China policy. What does One China mean? It means there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China. There's only one legitimate government ruling over all of China, and that is the People's Republic of China, based in its capital in Beijing. That is the official position of the United States government, yet they are playing this double game where they claim Taiwan is part of China, yet they constantly violate China's sovereignty over Taiwan. They constantly encourage and empower the administration on Taiwan to pursue separatism by militarizing the island and transforming it into a battering ram against the rest of China. Let's talk about the US arming Taiwan. This BBC article, this was from November 2023. The US is quietly arming Taiwan to the teeth. The article says when US President Joe Biden recently signed off on an $80 million grant to Taiwan for the purchase of American military equipment, China said it deplores and opposes what Washington had done. To the casual observer, it didn't appear a steep sum. It was less than the cost of a single modern fighter jet. Taiwan already has on order more than $14 billion worth of US military equipment. Does a miserly $80 million more matter? While fury is Beijing's default response to any military support for Taiwan, and we can see why, because the US recognizes Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, yet constantly violates that sovereignty. The article says this time it's something different. The $80 million is not alone. It comes from American taxpayers. For the first time in more than 40 years, America is using its own money to send weapons to a place it officially doesn't recognize. So that's even the BBC British state media admitting that the United States does not officially recognize Taiwan as any sort of country. This is happening under a program called Foreign Military Finance. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, FMF has been used to send around $4 billion of military aid to Kiev. So the US is using Taiwan, an island recognized by the US as China, as Chinese territory, is militarizing the island and the administration there and using it as a battering ram against the rest of China. So we can see why China would deplore and oppose this. It is an indisputable act of war, but it gets worse than that even. So the other article that I linked to in my Global Times piece was this one from the Wall Street Journal. And you can see I am citing only Western media to make my argument here. This is from February 2023, so a year ago. US to expand troop presence in Taiwan for training against China threat. The Pentagon is helping Taiwan focus on tactics and weapon systems that would make the island harder to assault. Harder for China to enforce its sovereignty over. That this is what the United States is doing. And it says the US is markedly increasing the number of troops deployed to Taiwan by more than quadrupling the current number to bolster a training program for the island's military amid rising threat from China. How can there be a rising threat from China inside Chinese territory? The US plans to deploy between 100 and 200 troops to the island in the coming months, up from roughly 30 there a year ago. So this has been ongoing, this US troop presence on Taiwan, despite the State Department recognizing Taiwan as part of China. This is all very deliberate. This is a very deliberate provocation. The larger force will expand a training program the Pentagon has taken pains not to publicize as the US works to provide Taipei with the capabilities it needs to defend itself without provoking Beijing. This is exactly what the US was doing in Ukraine before Russia launched the special military operation. They were creating a grave national security threat right on Russia's borders. And we could only imagine if it was the other way around, if it was Russia or China doing this in, let's say, Canada or Mexico, how unacceptable that would be. When the United States does it in Eastern Europe or in Asia Pacific, somehow this is okay. And anyone reacting to this, they're the ones in the wrong. So this is the reason the US is building its military forces up in Asia. It's not to protect against Chinese aggression, but it's to reinforce America's own aggression, its own violation of Chinese territorial integrity, its own violation of Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan that the US government officially recognizes. It's all about the US reinforcing its own violation of international law and its own policy of maintaining primacy over the region. Again, you have to remember, thousands of miles away from American shores. So I will go back to the article I wrote for Global Times. I will continue. I just wanted to really explain that part right there about the actual status of Taiwan versus the perception the Western media tries to create. Thus, General Moore, by saying the US doesn't want war, despite doing all within its power to provoke one, is essentially saying that if war is to be avoided, China should simply accept American domination. Not only are these US ambitions unacceptable, they are also untenable, including US Air Force plans to reorganize its forces ahead of a potential war with China. One of the centerpieces of a future US Air Force is the development of uncrewed aircraft through the Collaborative Combat Aircraft CCA or Loyal Wingman program. It envisions the creation of affordable mass for its forces by combining cheaper and more numerous unmanned aerial vehicles alongside manned warplanes. This is meant to offset China's advantage in both manpower and manufacturing. The fatal flaw of this premise is assuming that China doesn't have the ability to outproduce and outnumber the US in terms of both crewed and uncrewed aircraft. China is, in fact, already developing its own Loyal Wingman UAV. So let me just quickly take a break and show you this from the War Zone. This was from September 2021. China is cloning Kratos's XQ-58A Valkyrie unmanned air combat vehicle concept. The FH-97 drone is nearly identical to the XQ-58A, and its capabilities could be extremely attractive for the People's Liberation Army Air Force. And they show a picture of the FH-97, and we always hear this claim over and over again that if any nation outside the West produces advanced technology, could only be because they copied it from the superior white West. But this is a very long-standing, enduring theme. This is what the War Zone says about this Chinese drone, this Loyal Wingman drone. The Chinese FH-97 drone, which is being offered by the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, CASIC, would seem to have been tailored to fulfill the same kinds of combat roles as envisioned for the Valkyrie, which is being developed for the US Air Force as the centerpiece of its work on unmanned attritable platforms, drones that are low cost yet still survivable enough that they can be employed in high-risk situations that might preclude the use of more costly assets. What makes the FH-97 especially interesting is that it suggests strongly that China is following the path now being taken by the US Air Force and increasingly by other air forces too, toward fielding a stealthy, attritable drone optimized for flying more hazardous sorties, including strikes, electronic warfare, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance within contested airspace. So again, it's China has this, but they copied it from the West But whether they copied it or not is irrelevant. The fact is they have it. They have the industrial base to produce it in vastly greater numbers than anything the US could produce. So while this was supposed to be a technology meant to offset the advantages China had in numbers, China is able to match the US and actually exceed them in this capability as well. The idea that the United States has some sort of monopoly or advantage over technological quality, able to offset the advantages Russia or China have in terms of quantity, this is a very outdated mode of thinking. This is no longer the case. Russia and China can not only match the US in terms of quality, they can vastly outproduce the US in terms of quantity. When you understand that whatever the US is capable of developing to try to offset its disadvantages, and China is able to match, when you take that and you add it to the fact that the US is trying to fight this war thousands and thousands of miles away from its own shores, at the end of supply chains thousands of miles long, then you can start to see how detached from reality this entire foreign policy of trying to contain China actually is. Let me get back to my Global Times piece. Let me continue reading from there. Another aspect of US Air Force reorganization is the creation of composite wings and the shifting to its agile combat employment strategy, also known as ACE, of distributing these wings across a greater number of bases in the Indo-Pacific. This is meant to offset China's advantage in long-range precision missiles and their ability to target and destroy US bases in the region. The ACE strategy is meant to shift US air power around from base to base, making it more difficult for China to locate and target US assets, as well as harder to anticipate where an American attack may originate from. This is very similar to the distributed maneuver approach US-trained Ukrainian forces attempted to use against the superior firepower of Russian forces. It was assumed that superior Russian firepower could be overwhelmed by distributing larger numbers of Ukrainian forces in smaller independent units, making it difficult for Russia to target and concentrate firepower on them. In reality, Russian forces not only had superior firepower, they also had superior numbers, eliminating any advantage distributed maneuver may have lent Ukrainian troops. And I have covered that many times in the past regarding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The same principle applies to an attempt by the US to use a very similar strategy, albeit using its air assets in Asia Pacific. I remember going over this document. This is from the US Army Maneuver Center of Excellence. It's a PDF. The link is in the video description below. Defeating the Russian Battalion Tactical Group by Captain Nicholas J. Fiore. And I believe this was published in 2017. Clearly, it was published before the Russian special military operation began. This is what the paper says. It says, the Battalion Tactical Group's strategic imperative is to control terrain to shape post-conflict negotiations. When possible, the BTG commander will employ his strike assets to cause casualties to pressure his opponent to negotiate a settlement. But he must also preserve his own strength because it cannot be regenerated operationally and casualties are strategically expensive. To preserve combat power, battalion tactical groups employ a force of local paramilitary units as proxy forces to secure terrain and guard the battalion tactical group from direct and indirect attack. So Captain Fiore is talking about how powerful the battalion tactical group is in terms of long-range fire, but how limited it is in terms of its own infantry. And so they employ paramilitary units in and around where they're based. But this all goes back to claims by the US that the Russian military was already operating in the Donbas region before 2022. And after Russia began the special military operation, they were using their battalion tactical groups somewhat in this way as described in the paper. Now, the paper identifies the primary weakness and how to exploit it. He says, command and control limitations require the battalion tactical group commander to concentrate mission command and intelligence assets to direct fires and electronic warfare shaping efforts and strikes. These assets are employed selectively to substitute for offensive maneuvers, are not available across the entire battalion tactical group's battle space, and can be overloaded by aggressive dispersion and displacement tactics. So what he's trying to say is that if you ever look at the chart, organizational chart of a Russian battalion tactical group, you can see how heavy it is in terms of firepower, artillery, guns, rockets, tanks. It has all of this heavy firepower. It has between 600 to 800 men. And what it's supposed to do is concentrate overwhelming firepower on enemy units. And he's suggesting that Ukrainian forces form many smaller groups, spread out, and advance quickly and independently of one another, so that the battalion tactical group doesn't have enough time to target, concentrate firepower on, and destroy all of them before they come in range of the battalion tactical group and start inflicting heavy losses on them, compelling them to withdraw. However, come 2022, the Ukrainians launched an offensive toward Kherson city. Russia was no longer using this model based around the battalion tactical group. They began forming divisional-sized defenses with tens of thousands of soldiers. They had more than enough infantry coming in, and they adequately outfought Ukrainian forces. And then they did the very same thing again in 2023 when Ukraine launched its spring-summer offensive. They decisively defeated the Ukrainian offensive. The U.S. Air Force Agile Combat Employment, or ACE strategy, it's likewise meant to facilitate some sort of aggressive dispersion and displacement, only in terms of using U.S. air power instead of ground forces. It's meant to overload China's very significant anti-access area denial capabilities. That would be their integrated air defenses, their long-range precision-guided missiles, their air power, everything that they use to create a defense that the U.S. military is unable to push through.
So I would say that there are two separate parts of this. There's posture, and that is how our forces are bedded down day to day. And then there's what we think we'll do in the event that crisis turns to conflict, and that's ACE. The purpose of ACE is to complicate the targeting solution and to make ourselves unpredictable in order to enhance survivability. And we've talked a lot about the concept of pulsed operations. The purpose of ACE is to make those pulses unpredictable, the origin unpredictable, the timing unpredictable, and the targets unpredictable. And so ACE is not about realigning posture in the Pacific, but it is about creating opportunities for us to operate in a way that doesn't focus solely on main operating bases. Those main operating bases will remain important. There is a great deal of construction going on Guam, because Guam is going to be one of the cornerstones of our posture in the Pacific, both in competition and in crisis in the event that it evolves into conflict the same. So I think what you'll see is us setting ourselves up for austere operations, quick pulses, unpredictable movements, so that we can enhance survivability and therefore lethality. Ultimately, sortie generation is a part of that as well. Those things all go together, I would say.
The U.S. figures they can disperse their air power to make it harder for China to wipe it out in a small number of attacks, and then they can surge forward and overload China's ability to acquire and destroy these targets before the U.S. starts inflicting losses on Chinese forces. The problem is, of course, China not only has all of these capabilities, they also have an advantage in numbers, just like Russia now in Ukraine, which is going to make it impossible for the U.S. to actually successfully use this strategy. I will go back to my article. I explain it in my article. I'd say, likewise, for U.S. Air Force units distributed across the Indo-Pacific region using the ACE strategy, they will be going up against not only China's superior missile capabilities, but also superior numbers of Chinese warplanes, as well as advanced integrated air defense networks. And just another thing I want to throw in there, Western military analysts admit that China has air-to-air missiles with much longer ranges and better capabilities than their American counterparts. In simpler terms, the US is attempting to achieve the impossible. It is a nation with a smaller population, a smaller industrial base, and soon a smaller economy. The US military is being surpassed not only in quantity, but also quality by Chinese forces. In addition to that, US plans on waging its war against China, all while dangling at the end of a 10,000 kilometer long logistical chain. Like Napoleon's march on Moscow, the US is blinded by a deeply embedded belief of its own inherent superiority, incapable of objectively assessing the prospect of war with China, not only in terms of how it will be fought, but also whether or not it should be fought in the first place. Washington is aware of the many and multiplying advantages China has, hence this urgent reorganization of America's military forces. However, when comparing the balance of US and Chinese power, it seems to add inherent supremacy to their column, offsetting all other disadvantages, no matter how glaring or numerous, thus making one of the most senseless and avoidable potential wars in human history all but inevitable. And we can see the US speeding toward war with China, even as it loses its proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, and even as it flails and lashes out in the Middle East against Iran, who has come very close, if not past the point of no return, in terms of the US's ability to contain, divide, and destroy Iran and execute regime change, as US foreign policy planners have wanted to do for decades. The US military presence in Asia Pacific is built on a premise that the US can and should maintain primacy over all nations, and especially China. China cannot be allowed to surpass the United States. This is the premise that all US foreign policy is built around. It has been like this for decades, regardless of who is in the White House and who controls Congress. The US is creating a number of strategic dilemmas for China. I listed them, and all of this is meant to coerce Beijing into simply subordinating itself to a US-led international order, subordinate itself to the United States, not only in the region where it's located, Asia Pacific, but also subordinate itself to the United States within its own borders. The way the Chinese people manage their own affairs, that needs to be subordinated to the Americans. This is what drives US foreign policy. And as General Moore pointed out, the US prefers to avoid war with China. They don't want to fight a war with China. They just want China to submit without a fight. That would be the easiest option for the US from their point of view. That is how they think. Now, what does the US do to create these dilemmas? Number one, it bases US forces all over Asia, in South Korea, in Japan, all across Japan, increasingly in the Philippines. They're trying to get military forces into every country in the region. And what they hope is that when they provoke a war with China, China strikes their bases. They're using these countries and their territory as a sort of human shield. And they hope to provoke those nations, those host nations, into joining any sort of war with China on America's side. US is also threatening Chinese maritime shipping throughout the South China Sea. The US always says they're in the South China Sea to ensure freedom of navigation. Well, the vast majority of the maritime shipping in the South China Sea is going to and from China and to and from all of its trade partners in the region and beyond. And I already talked about Taiwan, how the US is arming the administration there and even basing US troops there on an island the US officially recognizes as part of Chinese territory. So they have created all of these dilemmas for China, and constantly holding China and the prospect of peace and stability in the region hostage, trying to force China into simply submitting to the US-led international order, allowing the US to reassert itself, prevent the rise of China, surpassing of the United States by China, the rise of multipolarism. That is why the US is creating these dilemmas. They've created a similar system of dilemmas for Europe and Russia, and also in the Middle East, as we can see. As I have pointed out many times before, this entire premise that this foreign policy is built on, all of these dilemmas stem from, it is irrational. It makes no sense. The US has 1/4 the population of China, has a smaller military, a smaller industrial base than China. It graduates millions fewer in key areas such as science, technology, engineering, which feed right into a nation's industrial, technological, and thus military power. The US also has to cross an entire ocean to threaten and menace China within its own borders, along its own coasts. The idea of China actually posing some sort of real problem to the United States is like Portugal claiming that because it had some vast empire long ago, it's unacceptable for the US to surpass it now in terms of economic, military, and diplomatic power. It is completely irrational. And just as Portugal, Spain, also the UK had to adjust to the new realities of the world, the US is going to have to as well. Or they can continue marching toward a war they almost certainly cannot win. If they cannot win their proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, they cannot win their proxy war and increasingly hot war with Iran in the Middle East. What makes them think that they're going to win this war against China in Asia Pacific? Problem is, the current circles of corporate financier interests shaping and driving US foreign policy, these are people incapable of the humility and the humanity necessary to re-examine and reorganize the premise US foreign policy is built on, and then the foreign policy itself. China wants to avoid war, and they are committed to patience and persistence in weathering US provocations and humiliations as China continues to grow, as it continues this process of surpassing the United States, until it arrives at a certain point in time where its military, economic, diplomatic power is so vast, they have irreversibly surpassed the US, and there's nothing the US can do about it, up to and including even waging war against China. That is what they're doing. They're trying to hold off this conflict for as long as possible so that they reach that point of no return where they irreversibly surpass the US. And the US is doing everything in its power to provoke China now while they believe they still have a chance to somehow militarily fight and win a conflict against China. We have to keep a very close eye on this. I will continue covering this along with my analysis of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and, of course, developments in the Middle East and elsewhere. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest people follow me on Telegram. I post absolutely everything there, including backups of all of my videos. In the video description below, there are also all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee or through Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just helping share my work with others out there, getting the word out there, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.